Hello, fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. I'm Marissa, and today I'm excited to chat about the books that I read in the month of February. So this wrap-up is a bit belated, but I think that's going to be the new norm for me lately because I really enjoy taking the time to process my reading, think about it a little bit, and take the time to just put together a really cohesive wrap-up for you guys. So I'm not going to apologize for it anymore, and we'll just get right into the books. The first book that I finished in the month of February was The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by Deesha Philyaw. Maybe 2022 is the year of short stories for me. I don't know, but between January and February, I ended up reading 3 short story collections. But this is one of the best short story collections I've ever read. I first heard about it on Jen the Librarian's channel as one of her favorites of 2021, and I picked it up right away on audiobook. Jen's channel is absolutely amazing. I've really been enjoying her videos lately, and I probably should have featured her in my last video all about different booktube channels that I've been enjoying. Her channel is wonderful. She is a Hardy lover, so she's done a lot of videos about Thomas Hardy. She reads a ton of LGBTQ plus fiction and has some great recommendations on that. And I just generally enjoy her videos. So I highly recommend that you check her out. And yeah, she's got really good taste in books if this book is anything to go by. The Secret Lives of Church Ladies consists of 9 stories all about American Black womanhood. The stories are about women navigating between the image of who they think they're supposed to be and the vision of who they want themselves to be. These women's own needs and passions and desires are pitted against who their mothers raised them to be and the specific brand of morality that their church has laid out for them, and just society's general expectations for them. Each story is about these women making peace with those external expectations while carving a space in their lives for their own visions of themselves. The stories explore queer relationships, mother-daughter relationships, complicated friendships, infidelity, loss, and so much more. In one story, 40-year-old lifelong friends struggle to come to terms with their complex friendship, which includes sex, even though one of the friends still considers herself a virgin and is saving herself for a good husband who simply hasn't come along yet. In another story, a daughter visits her mother in hospice while carrying on an affair in the parking lot with a married man who she met at the same hospice facility. And then, of course, there's the story where a teenage girl struggles to come to terms with her mother's coldness and long-term affair with the pastor. These little descriptions really don't do the complexities of these stories justice. These stories are full of such intricate details and nuanced characters that they seem real. This is most certainly a work of fiction, but if you were to tell me that Deesha Philyaw interviewed actual women and told their stories here, I'd believe you. They seem that real, that nuanced, and that complicated. The stories are intimate and powerful. They're raw and they're serious and they're sorrowful at times, but there's also this certain sense of humor and levity to the writing style. This is one of those very rare collections where each story stands out to me, and yet the stories are cohesive as well. Usually, unless it's an anthology of stories, written by different authors, that is nearly impossible to achieve. I didn't have to pause between each story to remember the characters or to have the story just be memorable. They were each really brilliant in their own right, and with each passing story, I just loved the collection more and more as a whole. I simply can't pick my favorite stories here because each of them was truly as well done and memorable as the next. This is a collection that I would love to own and reread in print and just keep on my shelves in general because it was really beautiful and it's something I want to go back to. The next book that I finished in the month of February is this massive chunker here, Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. As you might know from my Wolf Hall Along announcement video, I am tackling the Wolf Hall trilogy this year with Emily from Novell Novels and Tori from Hufflepuff Discovery. And as per our reading schedule, in February, I finished the first book of the trilogy. This series' reputation precedes it. Each book in the series has won numerous prizes. Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies both won the Man Booker, I believe, and most recently, the third in the series won the 2021 Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. So they're widely acclaimed books, but what did I think of them? Wolf Hall centers on Thomas Cromwell, one of Henry VIII's chief advisors. Cromwell came from humble beginnings and rose through the ranks to achieve great power. He helped engineer the annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, so Henry could marry Anne Boleyn. And in this way, Cromwell was instrumental in bringing about the English Reformation and legitimizing Henry VIII as ruler of the Church of England, no longer beholden to the Catholic Church or the Pope in Rome. This might sound like a recap of a history lesson, and it definitely is, but that is what Wolf Hall is all about. One of the beauties of this book is that it's nearly impossible to give spoilers. You've likely already learned the plot of the whole series in history class, and if you haven't, a quick Wikipedia search will fill you in on all the details. What makes this book so interesting and different from simply cracking open a history textbook is how it's told through the lens of Thomas Cromwell's experiences, through the eyes of a commoner. Cromwell was a blacksmith's son who arguably becomes the second most powerful person in Tudor times. And of course, the other thing that makes this book so remarkable is Hilary Mantel's writing and her execution of the epic tale. Pun intended. It's hard to say whether I liked this book or not, or whether it lived up to the hype for me. I have a lot of mixed thoughts and jumbled opinions of this book. There were moments of reading this where I thought, Hilary Mantel is a genius, and I was just sucked into this book. I was dog-earing pages and frantically jotting things down. But there were also moments where I was a bit fed up with the book and thought that it was too dense and unapproachable and obscure and a bit pretentious even. Hilary Mantel experiments with writing and breaks a lot of the standard rules. It's one of the things that makes this book so interesting, but it's also what can make it frustrating and hard to read. For example, her use of the word he can be infuriatingly hard to follow. Within the same sentence, she'll use the word he to refer to Cromwell and to the person Cromwell is speaking to, interchangeably. She plays with dialogue. She sometimes omits quotations around words that are clearly meant to be spoken by a character. She jumps around in time without much explanation. And to be clear, this is all purposeful, stylistic decision on Mantel's part. She's an amazing writer, and she knows what she's doing. But what she's doing is asking the reader to do a lot of mental work, to focus constantly throughout this 650-page book. And that's no easy feat. The kind of focus I needed to have while reading this book is the same kind of focus that I used to need while reading critical essays in college. The writing is intricate and beautiful, but to follow along, truly pay attention and follow along at all times, I needed to put in more effort than I usually like to in my leisure reading. That being said, Mantel does such a good job of convincing you of the Tudor world that you don't for a second feel like it's written by someone from the modern day. A lot of times with historical fiction, it's sharing a modern day perspective of past events. This book has that, but it's so subtle, and it's easily believed that her modern day perspective is actual history. And in fact, it's hard to tell where the fact ends and Hilary Mantel's opinion begins. She's clearly just done a ton of research to back up her beliefs, and this book is more historically centered than a lot of historical fiction that I read. Instead of questioning our modern day beliefs and our modern day society, it makes us wonder who these people were and how we interpret them as characters and how we interpret history. Not just Tudor history, but how we interpret the legend and legacy behind all historical figures of all different time periods. And then the way that Hilary Mantel treats the themes in this book is pretty brilliant. The thread of fatherhood is particularly strong in Wolf Hall. From Thomas Cromwell's upbringing with his abusive father to how he is a father to his children and a surrogate father to the various people that he takes under his wing. He looks to Cardinal Wolsey as a role model and a father figure. Then there's the idea of Henry VIII as a father figure to the country, and of course the anxiety of Henry VIII becoming a father, the need for him to create a male heir that fuels this whole plot and the whole history of England in many ways. And then there's this great contrast between Thomas Cromwell and Thomas More and Henry VIII, which is in essence this deep dive into class. Cromwell comes from nothing and works his way into power through his cunning and wit. He's viewed as a bit of a snake, and people simultaneously scorn him for his low birth and fear him for his power. The whole book has a very interesting contrast between the average domestic life of Thomas Cromwell and the noble figures in court. Anyway, there's obviously so much to discuss and unpack here with Wolf Hall. I just love talking about this book, and Tori and Emily and I had a Zoom chat recently where we did just that. So I'll be editing it and posting it sometime on my channel very soon, probably next week, so you guys can hear what they thought of Wolf Hall as well and hear us talk a little more about the series and the characters in depth. The next book I finished in the month of February was Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. I came to this book as an ardent lover of the Studio Ghibli film Howl's Moving Castle. Once upon a time, I told myself I would never read this book because I had already seen the movie, and I'm pretty particular when it comes to movie adaptations of books. I almost always want to read the book first to solidify an impression of the characters in my head before I see them on screen. But I don't know, something possessed me to listen to this on audiobook, and I am so glad that I did. Howl's Moving Castle, the book that is about Sophie Hatter, who works in the family hat shop while her other two sisters go to seek their futures elsewhere. Sophie is convinced that she is destined for this responsibility of running the family business when one day the Witch of the Waste comes to the shop and puts a curse on Sophie, which transforms her into an old woman. Realizing that no one would recognize her at the hat shop anymore, Sophie goes off on an adventure to break this curse. And in doing so, she meets wonderful, eccentric, and dramatic characters like Wizard Howl and the fire demon Calcifer and Michael. It's a wonderful middle grade adventure with fairy tale themes that is just so perfectly paced and such a delightful and charming read. Strangely enough, I ended up falling in love with the book even more than the movie, which is so weird because Howl's Moving Castle has been one of my favorite Studio Ghibli films for a while now. Both book and movie have the same whimsical tone and create fantastic magical worlds and memorable characters. But there are quite a few plot differences between the book and the movie. Honestly, I don't see why the movie changed so many aspects of the book. Perhaps they were trying to simplify the plot a bit to fit more seamlessly onto the screen, but I found that the result was just an oversimplification of characters and themes. I would say that the two biggest changes made in the movie are the introduction of the war and a new villain. For me, these changes had the effect of emphasizing different themes than the book had. The book emphasized freedom in terms of personal responsibility and destiny, whereas the movie transformed that theme of freedom into freedom against the establishment, against the government, and against convention in general. I love how the book explored the characters in more depth than the movie. Most of the main characters, at least, truly feel like the same people, but they're so much more developed and well understood in the book. It was like rediscovering one of my favorite movies by reading the book. It was an absolutely wonderful experience, and it's making me second guess my policy on reading the book before watching a movie in all cases. So I'd be really curious to know, have you read Howl's Moving Castle? Have you seen the movie? Which did you see first? Are you someone who has set rules for yourself about book to movie adaptations? I'd be interested in knowing how you feel about that topic and if your thoughts on that have changed over time, because I think mine just might have. Speaking of book to movie adaptations, I also read Death on the Nile in February because we had plans to see the new Death on the Nile movie. I read the book rather quickly, but our plans ended up falling through, so I still haven't seen the movie. I'll eventually see it, of course, but I'm not really sure when. Death on the Nile is one of the more famous and recommended Agatha Christie books. It's one of the Hercule Poirot books, and I think some people view it as a sequel to the Orient Express, probably because they both take place while Poirot is traveling. Death on the Nile is about a newly married heiress named Lynette, who tries to commission the famous Hercule Poirot to stop her former friend, Jacqueline, from stalking the newlyweds. Lynette had recently married Jacqueline's ex-fiancé, and Jacqueline is so steeped in resentment and bitterness that she insists on following the newlyweds as a form of revenge or as a sort of punishment for Lynette stealing the heart of her man. Things get complicated when everyone, including Hercule Poirot and a whole host of other wonderful characters, board a cruise ship down the Nile. Eventually, as the title implies, there is a death on the Nile, and Hercule Poirot's talents are needed to solve the murder. I enjoyed this book because of Agatha Christie and her writing style, but I have to say that this wasn't one of my favorite Agatha Christies. It actually surprised me how much it disappointed me for how famous it is. I found the pacing to be very slow for an Agatha Christie novel. No one actually dies until halfway through the book. The first half is all setup and character study, which can be immensely enjoyable and is something that Agatha Christie, of course, does remarkably well. But the title promised me a death, and I was really impatient for that to happen. I greatly prefer the Agatha Christie books where the action happens almost instantaneously, and then the rest of the book is spent unraveling what happened. I also find that Poirot really isn't one of my favorite Agatha Christie detective figures. The way Poirot functions as a detective, he has the power to see things and know things that other characters and readers simply don't. He fixates on details that prove important to the case in ways that we can't predict. And I find that watching him unravel the cases and exercise his little gray cells, as he always says, puts the reader at a bit of a distance from the other characters. Poirot is constantly the lens in which we view the entirety of the story. And I suppose you could argue that that's the purpose of a detective figure. They're the lens that helps the reader make sense and order out of the chaos of crime. But I feel like Poirot hogs the spotlight in this way a lot more than some detectives do. I'm pretty sure that I already talked about this in one of my other videos, but it's one of the reasons that I love Tommy and Tuppence so much as detectives. They bring us along on the adventure. We discover things with them or, maybe just a step or two behind them. They aren't in control at all times. They don't hold things back from us as a reader. Poirot is almost omnipotent. Okay, maybe omnipotent is an exaggeration, but he does have a ton of power in his books. And not much seems to hold him back besides his identity as a foreigner. And even that doesn't really stop him or hinder him. Poirot always seems to have complete control of the story and always seems to be one step ahead of us, but in a way that's not as fun as some other detective figures. Anyway, now I've definitely deviated from discussing Death on the Nile and gone too far on a tangent about Poirot as a character. But basically, if you like other Poirot novels and don't mind him as a character, you'll probably enjoy Death on the Nile more than I did. Even so, I find that Agatha Christie is a brilliant author, and her books, which aren't my absolute favorites, are still very enjoyable and would earn themselves a minimum of 3.5 or 4 stars if I was a star rating kind of girl. And last but not least, I also finished The Haunting Season this February. This was such a highly anticipated read of mine, and it didn't disappoint me. I can't believe that I read 3 short story collections in the first 2 months of the year. This genre is on fire for me this year. I'm really enjoying short stories. And this particular collection is stupendous. This is an entire anthology of spooky, gothic, wintry stories written by some of the best current historical fiction authors. The stories are predominantly set in the Victorian period, and it's just a short story collection that feels tailor-made to my tastes and interests. With the exception of one outlier story which didn't take place in the Victorian era, and whose author I had not heard of before, this book was sheer perfection. The authors that are featured in here are Bridget Collins, who wrote The Binding, which was one of my favorite books of 2021, Imogen Hermes Gower, who wrote The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock, which I did a review of, I believe, in 2018. I loved that book. Kieran Millwood Hargrave, who wrote The Mercies, which I didn't like as much as I thought I would, but her story in this absolutely blew me away. There's Andrew Michael Hurley, who's the one I hadn't heard of and don't plan on reading more of his work. There's Jess Kidd, who I've thought I'd like for a long time, and I really enjoyed her short story in this, so I have to read some of her work now. I have her book Himself on my shelves, and I think I have an e-copy of Things in Jars somewhere. And then there's Elizabeth McNeil, who's featured in this. She wrote The Doll Factory, which I thought was good, but I didn't like it as much as some people. But I do want to check out some of her other work, her newer work, which I can't seem to find in the States. And there's also, of course, Natasha Pulley, who is one of my favorite authors. I've talked about her plenty before. Now, the story that she has in here actually uses the characters of the Watchmaker of Filigree Street, and I think it kind of spoils those characters a bit if you haven't read The Watchmaker. So I don't know if I'd recommend her story in this unless you are familiar with The Watchmaker of Filigree Street, but I really enjoyed returning to that world and revisiting those characters. It really made me excited for, the reread of Watchmaker Filigree Street, which unfortunately I didn't get around to this February, but hopefully we'll get a chance to do at some point. And then, of course, there's Laura Purcell, who wrote The Silent Companions, and I want to read more of her stuff. This book as a whole has this amazing, unsettling tone, and it's just full of creepy, gothic gorgeousness. I love how all of the stories in this anthology, with the exception of The Hanging of the Greens, plays on Victorian-era fears and tropes. There are classic haunted houses, disappearances, a haunting exploration of single motherhood, ghostly patriarchal tyrants. One of the stories explores the dangers of childbirth and postpartum depression and how that relates to female hysteria and madness. Another story plays on Victorian photography and its relationship with ghosts and death, exploring 19th century spirit photography and also the practice of photographing the dead. The way these authors allow their stories to explore so many facets of Victorian society was just fascinating, and in many cases, these stories were in clear conversation with various Victorian literature. Kieran Millwood Hargrave's story dealing with postpartum depression was reminiscent in many ways of The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I got definite Dorian Gray vibes from one of the stories. I believe it was Laura Purcell's. And I feel like Bridget Collins' A Study in Black and White has to be a reference to Sherlock Holmes' A Study in Scarlet. So if you are a lover of Victorian literature and the Gothic, you absolutely must read this collection. It is wonderful. I'm so happy that I have it on my shelves and can revisit it during the long winter nights. As the title implies, it is best for. So those are all the books that I read in the month of February. I would love to hear what you read in the month of February. If you've read any of these books before, what did you think of them? Have you seen the Death on the Nile movie? What do you generally think about book-to-movie adaptations? Do you have to read the book first? Do you actually prefer to watch the movie first? Do you not have any hard and fast rules? Or have your perceptions changed over time? Have you read the Wolf Hall trilogy? Because I feel like that is just a whole conversation in and of itself. I'd love to hear all of your thoughts in the comments down below. And until next time, I look forward to seeing you in another video very soon. Bye!